I have a couple of more messages that go over pictures of Christ in the Old Testament. And I don't know about you guys. I hope you're getting something out of this. I hope you're seeing something maybe that you didn't see before. But I know I have. I have learned so much just by going through the Old Testament and seeing like, oh, well, before you thought it was just there, right? It was just a story. But now you know that that story has so much more meaning. And it's so interesting that the amount of information that we overlook. When we think we already know something. I've already read that before. And then the details that you skip because you think they're maybe not pertinent to the story. But every detail is there for a reason. And God has filled the Old Testament, really the entire Bible, with details about who Christ was and who he was going to be and what he was meant to do and what he came to do. So a lot of people will tell you that the devil is in the details. But the devil isn't in the details. Jesus is. So tonight we're going to look at a really small section of Scripture that has some pretty large implications. Now, I know some of you, when you hear, I'm just going to get this out of the way so we can be done with it, okay? When I say Jesus is the rock and you hear the rock, some of you think of this guy. Okay? And then some of you think maybe of an old movie, right? Everybody remembers that old movie. But let's just clear all those images from your mind. We're not talking about the movie or that guy. We were talking about the rock. And we're talking about the one that Moses encountered in the wilderness, the one that brought life-giving water to unworthy but thirsty people. Now, the Old Testament is rich with symbolism and foreshadowing, and if you're not careful, you'll miss it. Now, before I give everything away and just preach my sermon in 5 minutes, let's set the scene for what's happening here. How did we get here? How did we arrive here? What has happened to get us to this point? And I know that we've been through a lot of this together, so I'm not going to rehash the entire thing, but there's something we need to cover, and it's very crucial for our understanding of the Old Testament. And it happened about 400 years after Noah and the flood. And that is the covenant. And now I'm talking about the Abrahamic Covenant, and it's listed in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, different parts of it. But we're actually going to go to Genesis 17 and start there. So Genesis 17, chapter 17 and verse 1. And when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations out of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God appeared to Abraham, and he cut an irrevocable contract with him. And God promised him that he would provide a land, a nation, and a seed. Then he changed Abram's name to Abraham, because Abram just meant high father, but Abraham meant father of many nations. So he changed his name to reflect the promise of becoming a father of many nations. Now, the rest of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is the story of God making good on that promise. He allowed Abraham to have children who would become the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, who would dwell in the land of Israel, who would produce the special seed, a Messiah. And this was not just a fleeting promise, it was an enduring promise. God said that his covenant would be an everlasting covenant, And since God was the only one making the promises, then it would stand. Now, if you remember back in Genesis 15, when the covenant was actually cut, Abraham was asleep. God caused him to fall asleep. And only God walked through the animals, right? If you remember the custom of a covenant back then, both parties would walk through the split animals. Both parties would do it, symbolizing that if I break this covenant, let me be dead, just like they are. But God was the only one who did it, signifying that it was all up to him. So God was the only one obligated to keep his promise. God has kept every promise that he has ever made, and this one is no different. So the land and the nation seemed pretty obvious. But just to be sure everyone knew what the seed was all about, Paul explains it in the New Testament later, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. So if you go to Galatians chapter 3, it says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ." So the seed was Jesus. The seed that would come from Abraham and that would bless all nations was Christ. That's who the seed was. The same seed that was mentioned in Genesis 3:15. Next, we see supernatural proof of this covenant, of God's promise. Israel, the land of Israel, was the promised land. Why? Because that was the land promised to Abraham by God. Now, if you want supernatural proof, which everybody does, if you want supernatural proof that God exists, consider the Jewish people and the land of Israel. In AD 135, the Romans completely kicked the Jews out. They were not in the land of Israel. The Jews did not return to live there until 1948. So for 18 centuries, the Jews were without a homeland, yet they remained a people. No nation has ever survived without a homeland for more than a few generations. It is a genuine miracle of God that the Jews remained a people for over 1,800 years as they were dispersed. Let me ask you this. Have you ever met a Hittite or a Girgashite or an Amorite or a Canaanite or a Perizzite or a Hivite or a Jebusite? No. Why? Because those nations disappeared. They got invaded. They lost control of their land. They were gone. No more. Yet the Jews remained a people despite the fact that they were without a homeland for 1,800 years. Now, why does this happen? How did this happen? It's because God promised them they would always have a land, they would always be a nation, and there would always be a seed. And this is not coincidence. It's not dumb luck. It's all part of a divine plan. God gave Abraham this threefold promise despite the fact that Abraham was far beyond childbearing years. He was 99 years old. 99. Okay? And the land was occupied by pagan nations. So it wasn't like he was a young guy and here's this big land over here with nobody in it. No, he was old and the land was occupied. But God was faithful to his word. He gave Abraham a son, Isaac, who had a son, Jacob, who had 12 sons, including a boy, Joseph. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Joseph's 11 brothers really didn't like him. They were jealous of him. They didn't like the special treatment that he got from their dad. They didn't like the way he talked about himself. They didn't like his dreams. They thought they were delusions of grandeur. So what did they do? They dumped him to a well, and they told their dad, they told Jacob, that Joseph, his favorite son, was dead. Now, when I was younger, I used to pray for brothers. I wanted a brother so bad. And even many brothers would be awesome. Until I read the story of Joseph. And then I decided that everything was okay, just like it was. A sister really wasn't that great, but it wasn't that bad. So Joseph got rescued out of the well, and he was sold into slavery. He was brought to Egypt. He climbed the corporate ladder. only to be falsely accused and then thrown into jail. Then he spent time there, and he moved up the criminal justice ranks. Then he encountered a couple of Pharaoh's servants and interpreted their dreams when he was in jail. Now, it wasn't good for one of them, by the way. But the cupbearer, he forgot about him, right? He said, I will remember you, but then he didn't. Until Pharaoh had a dream. And then the cupbearer's like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And so because of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, he informed Pharaoh that there was a famine that was coming. He encouraged Pharaoh, like, you need to store up grain. It's going to be short. That's what he did. And Pharaoh trusted Joseph. Why? Because he was the only one who could tell him what his dream meant. So he made Joseph his right-hand man. Now, in the meantime, what was happening where Joseph's brothers were? It was famine, right? So they had to come to Egypt. They had to find food. And surprise, surprise, they appeared before their brother Joseph. And after the tearful reunion ensued, Joseph's shocking dream came true. Joseph's family came to Egypt with Joseph, and they started having children, lots and lots of children, because they were homeschooled families. And the nation started building up. And I want to pause here just for a minute, because I want you to understand, I want to make sure that everyone understands the point of the account of Joseph's life. It wasn't that God will bless you even though your siblings don't like you. That wasn't the point. It wasn't that Joseph was a hard worker and God blessed his effort. No. It wasn't that he was faithful to God even in bad circumstances, or that if you wait, God will bless you with a good job even though you have a bad one now. The point of Joseph's story is that God is faithful to keep his promises. And he will use mankind to carry out his will and his promise, even when we have no idea what is going on. We just need to trust him. God promised a land. He promised a nation. He promised a seed. Without Joseph going through all that he went through, that wouldn't have been possible. You see, God brought him to Egypt. God let him be put in jail. God allowed him to hear the dream and interpret it. God gave him that ability. God put him where he was to preserve Israel, specifically Judah, so the seed could be born. That was the point of Joseph's story. Now, as the years went on, Joseph died, his brothers died, Pharaoh died. Now, all these people are living in Egypt. And now they're under a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. What does Pharaoh do? He enslaves the people. And that's how the Jews ended up as slaves for 400 years in Egypt. Now, for the next 4 centuries, they worked and worked and they multiplied, right? And Pharaoh thought he could make them smaller by working them harder, but that didn't work. And you see, 400 years is the exact number that God told Abraham in Genesis 15. He told them that they would be oppressed for 400 years. That's exactly what happened. So they had 400 years of harsh labor. They had 400 years of horrible conditions, 400 years of frustration. And you have to think that the cry of those enslaved people had to be, God, when are you going to make good on your promise? When are you going to give us a land you promised Abraham? So finally, God sent the Jews a deliverer. His name was Moses. He led them out of Egypt and into the promised land. Now, that journey wasn't easy. It should have been, but it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was kind of a nightmare. Why? Because the Jews had a tendency to complain. They complained about everything. They complained about their circumstances, and they lacked faith. They lacked faith that God would keep his promise. They lacked faith that God would bring them into the promised land. And that's what brings us to the courtroom. We're about to see some drama unfold here. The Jews had just crossed the Red Sea that God had parted. They had just went through the Red Sea on dry land. They had just finished singing a song that was 21 verses long, and they didn't even skip the third verse. But they hike into the wilderness for 3 days, and the wheels fell off. So go to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus 15, and we'll start in verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. They had so little faith. They were only 3 days in, and they're already doubting. But God provided for them anyway. Why? Because he keeps his promises. He's faithful to his promise. Now, the Jews had just witnessed terrible plagues, the worst environment imaginable. They saw the Red Sea part, and now bitter water turned into sweet. The very next scene, the Bible shows God providing bread for them and meat for them in the wilderness, which we'll cover in a few weeks. And you would think that the Jews would have enough evidence to believe that God was going to take care of them. That's what you would think. But they had an extremely short-term memory. So next you'll see the forgetful witnesses. The Jewish people, they had witnessed all of this, but they forgot. They had witnessed all the miracles that God performed for their deliverance, but they didn't remember. So Exodus chapter 17 in verse 1. And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said unto them, "Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses, and they said, "Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us, and our children and our cattle with us, with thirst?" And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, "What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me." I don't know how this happens. I mean, seriously, just 2 chapters earlier, God provided the Jews with water from something they couldn't drink. He provided them with bread that came from heaven. He provided them with quail. Nobody had to go out and shoot. But now, here they are, fighting with Moses about water again. Now, the Hebrew word for chide is the root of meribah, which means they lodged a formal complaint against Moses. It was a formal complaint. This was a legal term. Israel was filing a lawsuit against Moses. That's what that word means. And Moses was no dummy. He wasn't an idiot. He knew that as God's representative to the people, he realized that their lawsuit was actually against God himself. It wasn't against Moses. And now God's on trial. Look at verse 5. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod, wherewith thou smotest the river, take it in thy hand and go. Behold, I will stand before thee upon the rock in Horeb." So, due to the extreme seriousness of the charge, God formalized it. And he said, this is their accusations, and we're going to have a courtroom. He instructs Moses to stand before the accusers, and he says, bring elders with you. They're going to serve as judges. They're going to serve as witnesses, and we're going to see what happens in this lawsuit. And Moses' staff plays a huge role in this, because this was the staff of authority. It was a symbol of authority to make judgment and to pass the sentence. This was the staff of judgment that God gave Moses to execute justice with Pharaoh. Now, in case you didn't know, in Israel, a guilty criminal would be placed before the judge, and the judge would use his rod to administer justice on the guilty criminal. If you flip over just a couple of books to Deuteronomy chapter 25, it says, if there be a controversy between men, and they come into judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down, and he be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. And it says 40 stripes, you can't go any more than that. That's what the rod was used for. It was a symbol of authority, but it was also used to punish the wrongdoer. But here, God, he submitted himself to be punished by the very same rod that he gave Moses. In the Old Testament, the accused would stand before God's representative. But here, God stood accused before a human court. And now God stood on the rock. He was awaiting judgment from his guilty accusers. This is a staggering scene because God permitted criminals to place him, the judge of the universe, on trial. The Creator allowed his creation to pass the sentence and execute judgment on him with the rod of judgment. So now God, the innocent one, stands in place of the guilty ones. And we now witness one of the most astonishing scenes in the entire Old Testament. God is giving Moses the final decree. He says, behold, I will stand before thee upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Now, in his book, The Unfolding Mystery, Discovering Christ in the Old Testament, Dr. Edmund Clowney describes the event, and I'm just going to read what he said. He says, before the faces of Moses the judge, with his rod uplifted, stands the God of Israel. The Lord stands in the prisoner's dock. Moses cannot strike into the heart of God's Shekinah glory, but God commands him to strike the rock. God, the rock, identifies himself with the rock by standing on it. God stands in the place of the accused, and the penalty of the judgment is inflicted. Is God then guilty? No. It is the people who are guilty. In rebellion, they have refused to trust the faithfulness of God. Yet God, the judge, bears the judgment. He receives the blow that the rebellion deserves. The law must be satisfied if God's people are to be spared. He must bear their punishment. Now, this is not just something I came up with. This is not just something that Dr. Clowney fabricated. This is truth. This is in the Bible. And the clarification comes 1,500 years later. 1,500 years after this courtroom drama unfolded, Paul tells us exactly who the rock was. So go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Starting in verse 1. He says, moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all of our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Jesus is the rock. Now, the Jews had this tradition that the actual rock that Moses struck followed them through the wilderness, providing water. But Jesus provided so much more than just water. Jesus Christ, the righteous one, stands in the place of guilty people, and he receives the punishment that we deserve. Jesus, the innocent, stands in place of the guilty accusers, that they might be found innocent. Jesus, the just, was treated if he were unjust, so the unjust ones could be made just. Jesus was placed on trial by guilty people, sentenced by guilty people, executed by guilty people, to redeem guilty people. The trial at Meribah was a picture of the trial of Jesus. God was falsely accused. Jesus was falsely accused. God stood on trial before men. Jesus stood on trial before men. God stood in the place of men. Jesus stood in the place of men. God was stricken. Jesus was stricken, smitten, and afflicted. God, the innocent, paid the fine for the guilty. Jesus, who knew no sin, was made to be sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God. God led the Jews with his presence in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. They had to know that it was God leading them everywhere they went. But still they questioned the direction. They questioned, why are we here? Why are we going here? They questioned God's plan. They were so caught up in their emotions. They were so caught up in their flesh. They were so caught up in what they thought was a need that they didn't see what was right in front of their face. God was leading them. And he is always faithful to keep his promises. They knew that. He had never broken a promise. He had kept every one. But still they doubted. Why did they doubt? God was the only one obligated to the covenant. He wasn't going to fail. Now, as we prepare to close and our musicians come, I want you to see that God gave them yet another picture of the gospel. God showed them that guilty people need him to pay the fine for their law breaking. Now, most of the Jews failed to grasp this. They continually attempted to satisfy God's justice through their self-righteous efforts. They missed the gospel. They missed grace. Have you missed the gospel? Have you missed grace? Do you think that God is going to be impressed with all the things that you do? Do you think that God will be impressed with all of the things you don't do? Like all those sinful people, like the publicans. God is not going to be impressed. Why would he send his son to suffer and die a horrible death on a cross if you could earn your salvation by what you do? It's only through grace. Stop trusting yourself. Start trusting God's plan. Repent of your sin and believe the gospel today.